The great thing about the Krays was you got double everything. They were a formidable force.
On the 8th of May 1968, Scotland Yard detectives arrested the notorious Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, in an operation that would attract worldwide attention.
If they had a gift, it was a gift for violence. These were violent professionals.
Hi, I'm Nick from Underworld Uncut. To truly understand the Kray twins, their rise, their reign and their downfall, we turn to one of Britain's leading organised crime experts, Professor Dick Hobbs, the man who knows the Krays inside out.
I think to understand the Krays, you've got to understand East London and the environment that they were reared in. The Krays came from a Romani and Jewish background, which was not that unusual in the East End at the time, you know. And the Krays came from a background, again, which was not that unusual in so much as Dad was a bit of a ducker and diver. He'd travel around the country. He was a wardrobe dealer. He'd buy and sell clothes. He would buy and sell gold. He was on the go. He was on the move. He was an entrepreneur. He was busy. He was a typical East End male in that respect. And the other thing that was important as far as the Krays bringing up was boxing, which came from both the grandparents. Both the grandfathers were boxers, were fighters, and they were reared to fight. But again, that wasn't that unusual in the East End. You know, boxing was a sport like football. It was something that all boys did. It was taught at school. People boxed. People fought in the street. It was everyday stuff. And the Krays were reared with that. So on the one hand, they've got this entrepreneurial spirit, this ducking and diving. You always work for yourself. You never work for a governor. They got that from undoubtedly they got that from their dad, who wasn't around very much. And then on the other side, they got the boxing, they got the fighting, and they got that from the grandparents. Now this left a gap, and the gap was filled by their mother, Violet, who in many ways a typical East End matriarch. She was the boss, she was the governor, and they were her boys. And she ran the family. Dad wasn't around very much. Old Charlie wasn't around very much. So it was important for Violet to fill that gap. And the other person that was important was another very strong woman, was Aunt Rose, who lived just adjacent to the twins in Valence Road. And she had a big influence on them as well. And she seemed to have an understanding of the twins. And she was the one that suggested, I think it was Ron, that one day Ron would hang. You know, people talked like that in those days. They were harsher. They would say that kind of thing. One day you'll go to prison. You could hang one day. You mustn't do this. You mustn't do that. I'm going to call a policeman if you don't do it. You know, it was normal. So I don't think that comment had any impact on her at all. In many ways, you know, all the things that I've said about the Krays, it was not that untypical of an East End background. The other thing that's really important about the Krays is that they were brought up as children during the Second World War. And there's a whole generation of very, very serious villains whose careers came to fruition in the 1960s that experienced the Second World War. In London, they experienced the bombing, they experienced the death, the destruction, the chaos, people coming and going, relatives not being around, not seeing people, and evacuation as well. And there's a whole generation of villains on the south side of the river, on the north bank of the river, the train robbers, etc., etc. All these guys were of that generation. And I think the experience of the Second World War, and particularly of evacuation, being evacuated out of London, out into the sticks, living with some family that may not look after them very well, I think that chaos, that kind of unsettled environment, I think that probably did have an impact on the Krays. Well, gangsters are extortionists. This is what they are, they're extortioners. You learn to do that, and you learn to do that on the street. You need a reputation, and that reputation usually comes about from a very young age. Using violence on the street, local gangs, local groups, the guys in the street next door, the guys in the adjacent school. You build up, you fight with them, you win, you build up a reputation. When you get through to a certain age, maybe early teens or mid-teens, you start thinking to yourself, well, you know, I've got this reputation. How can I make some money out of it? How can I use it So you start to drop in on businesses, maybe the odd local pub. In the Krays case, it was the billiard hall. And they had a reputation. They'd already had a reputation for fighting on the street, in boxing, and for fighting the police as well. So when they went into the billiard hall at Mile End, and they started to clear out some of the toughs who were making the business unprofitable, and gradually they took money for clearing out those guys, and gradually it became unprofitable for the owner of the billiard hall to keep paying them. So he gave the place over to them. He sold it to them or gave it to them, I'm not sure what. But they gradually built up. And then from there, they used the billiard hall as a base to extend their extortionate activities to pubs. And basically you go in a pub and you'd say, I want £10 a week. Otherwise the place is going to get smashed up. There's going to be fights in here. And the guy says, oh no, it's not. There's not going to be fights. And that night there's a fight. You go in the next day and you say, where's the £10? So you build that up. And basically you do get a name as someone that does provide some security, because some pubs do have trouble with the Krays name associated with it. Magically, the trouble disappears overnight. So they started to build up as extortionists that way. And then they started to move into taking money from thieves. They were accused by robbers of the time in the East End of being thieves' ponces, because they would take money from thieves. So if you done a robbery somewhere, if you'd stolen a lorry load of meat or whatever out of the docks, the Krays got to know about it, they wanted a slice of the action, they wanted money. So they were extorting from absolutely everyone. But it was very, very local. It was very local. Most extortioners stay local. Their reputations have been gained locally and they stay local. What's interesting about the Krays, as with other successful gangsters, is they take their reputations and they make money from those reputations outside their local territory. And the obvious place for the Krays to go was the West End of London. The West End of London was the great honeypot. That's where there was gambling, that's where there was prostitution, that's where there was drink, that's where people went to spend their hard-earned leisure money. And that's where they went. They moved into the West End of London. And the way in which they got into the West End that took them out of their territory into another territory was very much via gambling. Well, they were the Kray brothers. There was three of them. There was Charlie Kray as well, who was the older brother. And everyone has said that Charlie was a hail fellow, well met, not a gangster at all. Everybody liked him, and he was the front man for the clubs and pubs. He was the guy. He was the meter and the greeter. As far as the two brothers are concerned, it appears that Reg was smarter. Reg was not suffering from mental illness, and Ron had shown symptoms of mental illness from quite early on. So Reg was far more adept at dealing with clubland, at dealing with staff, at dealing with managers, etc. But even he wasn't that interested. The Krays were more old school. The Krays were more like villains from the 20s and 30s, based on violence, not that sharp when it came to business. When they were young men coming through, they were spotted by the gangsters of the day. And the glamour is what they liked. They wanted the suits, they wanted the film stars, they wanted the singing stars, the show business side. This is what they really liked. And they really took to it like ducks to water, but they were not good businessmen. As time went on, as drink got a hold, as mental illness started to creep in on both the brothers, I think, there you've got a situation where the businesses that they touched really crumbled. They would take over a legitimate business that was highly profitable, and in a short time the profits would fly out the windows. So they were not that smart when it came to business, but they did like the high life. They liked the high life. They liked to be photographed with Sophie Tucker or Judy Garland or some visiting film star, and ideally photographed with George Raft, who they idealised. They loved the guy. So that's what they were really after. They wanted to be celebrity gangsters, and they were. They were well aware of their status as villains. They were well aware that this is how they made their money. There wasn't a lot of respect amongst those that kind of generation of villains, there wasn't a great deal of respect for people who did a hard day's work or had families and lived a kind of normative life. They thought those people were mugs, really, for getting up in the morning and going to work. This was not something that they had a great deal of respect for. So they'd chosen that way of life. It's inevitable that if you have that way of life that you will clash with the law at some point. But no, I don't think they felt that they'd done anything wrong. They needed to justify it, and they did. They took their cues not only from Hollywood, but they took their cues from an older generation of villains who had extorted money from local pubs, who had dominated the local neighbourhoods by violence. And if they had a gift, it was a gift for violence. They were good at it. You know, they proved that they could fight as young men on the street. They proved that they could fight in the ring, and they were good. They were good at violence. And the great thing about the Krays was you got double everything. There was two of them. They were a formidable force. You know, they were a violent force. But that was it really. If they had talents, two talents. One is in public relations, selling themselves. They were excellent at it. As they got older, they became better and better. But also for violence. These were violent professionals. They felt that the killings they committed were righteous killings. That these people, you know, they deserved it. That they were people who needed to be killed. That was their opinion. This is the way they lived, and that was it. So they didn't feel that they'd done anything wrong particularly. When it came to them being arrested, I don't think anyone was particularly surprised. With regard to people that lived that life, that were in the underworld, if you like, well, it was even less of a surprise for them, because by this time, their activities had become so blatant. They had, if you like, taken liberties. It was difficult to see how they were not going to get arrested. And they did. Well, this was a social event. You know, everyone knew it was coming sooner or later. These guys were society figures. They'd been on TV. They'd been interviewed on the BBC about their activities in London's nightlife. They were on the front pages and the back pages of the East London Advertiser most weeks throughout the 1960s. No one really knew very much about them, but people knew they were there. These were celebrity gangsters. There was an element of delusion about the Krays, and there's often an element of delusion about gangsters generally, in so much as they overestimate the power that they've got over people. And they never ever envisioned that the Cray firm, once they were put in the witness box, would turn Queen's evidence. That was the huge surprise. The idea was that they were going to take, the guys in the firm were going to take the rap, that they might go away, but there's no way would the Krays go away. And they did. The whole thing was turned on its head. The Krays had been arrested before, of course, and had spent time in prison before, and they'd also been released. They'd also got away with it, if you like. For this particular case, you know, it was fronted up by Nipper Reid, but he had a big team. They raided the homes. They took them out at dawn. It was a big story, and it was big news for the police, because don't forget, it was impossible for gangsters to actually operate without the cooperation of the police. The Krays had their pet police officers who they'd had for years, who'd been informing, who'd been giving them information, they'd been paying off. So this was big news, that somehow Nipper Reid had put together a case upon which these bank cops couldn't have any influence. So in that respect, I think that's the real significance of the arrest. It was enormously important for the police to have the cooperation of Cray associates, of people who were on the firm with the Krays. The Krays had assumed for many years that they had a real hardcore of very loyal people working around them, and that was proved to be not the case. So there was a considerable amount of cooperation by people that were driving for the Krays, people that were collecting money for the Krays, people that knew intimate details about the crimes they'd committed. And that, I think, came as an enormous surprise to both the twins. It was a huge event. You know, I was at school at the time in the 60s when the trial was on, and I was aware of it. You know, I was well aware of the trial. I was interested in it. It was covered in the press. This was a big deal. And I think what was interesting was that the way the Krays responded, the Krays didn't think they were going to go down, and they knew how to sell themselves. They watched all of those Warner Brothers B movies of the 30s and 40s with James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson, Humphrey Bogart, and particularly George Raft, who they adored and got to know quite closely later on. And they were interested in image. They were interested in how they looked. They had to have a fresh shirt every day. They had a silk tie. They had beautiful suits. I mean, these guys, when they were out and about, they wore handmade overcoats, cashmere overcoats. This is Hollywood, and it was Hollywood came to London, and when the trial was on, Hollywood came to the Old Bailey. It seems they found it very difficult. They were twins. They were close to each other. They'd been close in business. They'd been close in family, and from looking at their writings, their various writings, it was quite clear that they found it very difficult being apart from each other. They couldn't look after each other anymore. They couldn't associate, they couldn't talk to each other, they couldn't help each other. So this was the first time that it had really been separated for any length of time, and they found it difficult. Their businesses relied on reputation and threat, implicit threat. So it was difficult for them to apply that outside, but they were smart. I mean, Reg in particular became very, very good at using the Kray name in order to make money in different ways. Now, whether these were criminal enterprises or not, I don't know, but they were certainly very good at generating money from records, from T-shirts, from all kinds of activities. In many ways, you could see that the qualities that Reg Kray had when he was in prison in terms of still being a moneymaker and knowing the value of the brand. Reg understood the value of the Kray brand. I think the Krays should be remembered, and they should be remembered. People say, well, why should we be talking about gangsters? These are terrible people. You shouldn't be talking about them. Why don't you forget about them, etc. They're important for a number of reasons. I mean, they are icons of the 1960s. If you talk about the 1960s, you've got to talk about the Krays. They were there. Their impact on society, the way that we think about crime. If you talk about British gangsters, the Krays come up time and time again. So we can remember them for that in this brief blip, really, that they were active. I think we can remember them as icons of the old white working class as well. Because a lot of people look back at the Krays and they say, oh, they were wonderful people. You know, a lot of the crime that goes on now wouldn't have gone on when the Krays were about. Well, a lot of the crime that goes on now didn't go on then anyway. You know, you didn't have internet crime. No one was going to break into your house and steal your DVD recordings. We didn't have them. So there's an awful lot of glamorisation about what the Krays were about. They weren't Robin Hoods. They were villains. They were old school villains who looked up to the villains of the 20s and 1930s and took their key from them. So I would say that we should remember them as being icons of the 60s, stereotypical gangsters, but they are long in the past now. They are long gone.
We hope you enjoyed this video about the rise and fall of the Kray twins. For more content on notorious gangsters just like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. I'm Nick from Underworld Uncut. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.